Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of the Legal 123s, the ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad, and welcome to a new season.
I know. I'm so excited. We're entering to our 7th season. We got a lot of fun things in store for this season, Michael. And what are we going to do this year?
Well, as a business and health care law firm, we're sometimes triggered by certain buzzwords our clients will say in conversation. We know that there is potential disaster when we hear these words, and we are immediately on high alert. This season's theme is red flags.
Ooh, Michael, I think we have our first vocabulary word there, red flag. Now, according to my assistant, Siri, who we still employ, she went out and found me this great word from vocabulary.com, so very prestigious site. A red flag is either a literal warning of some danger, like the signal flag used of a sinking ship, which is that it would be a red flag if your ship is sinking, I think, or a figurative warning like the red flag a candidate's angry outburst sends to the voters about his temperament. So there you go. That's our vocabulary word.
Well, to be clear, we will not be talking about my dating relationships back in my single days. Our red flag season is kind of a cousin to our season 3 theme of dumpster fires.
Yeah, and I'm going to say on behalf of the audience, first off, thank you for not building an entire season around your single days.
You're welcome, Brad. I think we need to incorporate some fun into spotting the red flags. Our favorite radio station is a sports radio station in Dallas called The Ticket.
Yes, we do love The Ticket. You and I often have morning conversations about did you hear A, B, or C. In fact, The Ticket is so beloved, it was voted the number one thing about Dallas above the Texas State Fair, the Dallas Cowboys, and all other sport teams or other iconic Dallas things in Dallas.
Yeah, we've laughed many times over the years when the morning show will share a story and say they want to count the red flags. So let's do that this season.
Yeah. And whenever, in the way that works is whenever you hear a red flag, someone will say, ding.
Perfect. So let's do an example.
Okay.
I'll tell a short story kind of from our dumpster fire season.
Perfect.
As an example.
All right. I'm ready.
Bing,
ding, ding. Oh, wait.
Very funny, Brad.
Did I go too fast?
Yeah, I think you're waiting for the opportunity to ding me. So
okay. I promise to be fair.
Okay.
Try again.
All right. I want the audience to picture from our dumpster fire season a dentist that was appropriately named Dr. Nose.
Ding.
Most dentists are not fans of Coke because it's bad for your teeth. Dr. Nose liked a different kind of Coke.
Ding.
Dr. Nose liked to raise money by taking his potential investors with him for weekend trips to Vegas.
Ding. That's a total ding.
Our client, an investor, started hearing about lawsuits being filed by employed dentists and vendors against Dr. Nose.
There's a bunch of dings in there.
Yes.
Ding, ding, ding.
Okay, well, that should paint the picture. I think we should jump in on today's story.
All right. Who is our outside guest that we have brought to drop some great knowledge on our audience today, Michael?
Brad, you know that this season's mostly going to be guest-free and focused on you and I telling stories.
Ding.
I think you're not getting it yet, Brad. But I agree. Perhaps it's only fitting that it is a red flag to do a whole season without guests.
It does give double meaning to the red flag theme. Deep thoughts.
Yes. All right. Well, coincidentally, Brad, today's story is also about a dentist.
Ding?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. His story is not nearly as nefarious as Dr. Nose, so you'll have to pay attention for the red flags.
All right. Sounds a little bit boring since we know how much fun we had with the Dr. Nose story, but I understand.
Yes, and it would not be good for business if all of our deals involved a dentist who snorted coke and stole money from their investors.
Ding.
Yes. There, you got it now, Brad.
All right, I'm ready. Thanks for setting up the expectations.
Okay. Our dentist today was fresh out of school and wanted help with us reviewing and negotiating his first contract in Austin, Texas. Hook 'em horns.
All right.
We will call him Dr. Green.
All right, tell the audience why Dr. Green.
Well, Dr. Green was baby-faced and a little naive about the business side of dentistry. He had big dreams, but little experience.
And, Michael, this is pretty common. We see this all the time. You and I have been blessed to be able to lecture at different dental and medical schools, and it's amazing how little education that one of these future doctors get on the receiving on their profession and the business decisions they will make and legal decisions they'll make.
For sure, yeah. And so the first thing I wanted to explore with Dr. Green was his vision for his future practice.
All right. Well, we tell our clients that when you want to explore, the first question we often ask is, what's your plan A and plan B? Because we want to understand what they plan to do with their practice.
Yeah. I mean, it's a next level adulting conversation for sure, and something they haven't probably really done before. But it's the ultimate, what do you want to do when you grow up conversation, at least on professional level.
Yeah. And that plan A is that, and then plan B is if that doesn't work out, there's your plan B.
Right. And so Dr. Green wanted to join a practice with a respected dentist. He wanted to work full-time with that practice and eventually buy in as a partner to the practice.
Okay. That sounds like a very traditional conversation we'd have with their first contract. So that's plan A. What's plan B for him?
Well, for him, he would move back to his home, to a small town where he grew up. He could not afford financially to make a mistake and invest in the wrong practice. So he was either going to join and buy into this metropolitan multi-location practice or go hang a shingle back in the small town, West Texas town, that if it failed.
All right, so that's his plan B. So, Michael, what did his employment contract look like?
Well, it was actually an independent contractor agreement.
Ding!
Good job, Brad. Explain the red flag.
All right, you said plan A would be he'd work full-time for a multi-location practice. An independent contractor, by definition, cannot be a full-time role.
Our next vocabulary word is independent contractor.
Yeah.
The easiest way to explain an independent contractor is to talk about it in conjunction with an employee. So think about it this way. When a business writes a check to a individual, the IRS is going to characterize it in one of maybe 4 different ways. You can characterize it as a W-2 payment to an employee,
sure,
as a 1099 payment to an independent contractor.
Yep.
It could be a distribution to an owner, or it could be a loan. And it wouldn't be taxed if it was a loan, at least at that moment in time,
sure,
if you were borrowing money. And so we obviously know that Dr. Green was not borrowing money, and he wasn't yet an owner.
Correct.
And so it really comes down to one of 2 things. Are you going to be characterized as an independent contractor and receive a 1099 payment, or are you going to be characterized as an employee and be receiving this W-2? And it makes a difference because in an employer-employee relationship, the employer has to pay all the payroll taxes, and if you're an independent contractor, that responsibility falls onto the independent contractor.
Yeah, and thankfully the IRS does have a test to help employers figure out if someone's really an independent contractor versus being an actual employee. But I think, Michael, we should discuss that later in this episode.
Yes, and the risk for misclassification, so that's the calling someone an independent contractor when they are actually an employee, is pretty significant to the employer. And it's not as simple as the employer being able to say, I'm going to deem you an independent contractor, and then you move on from that. The IRS has protective measures in place along the lines of what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Michael, I think the audience is going to wonder why, when we were advising Dr. Green, if there's all the exposures on the practice, what's his problem?
Did I mention that there were 6 other dentists at the practice and all were independent contractors?
No, and ding and ding and ding.
Exactly. So remember, we have to go back to Dr. Green's plan A. He didn't just want to go and work for a practice in Austin, Texas. He wanted to eventually buy into the practice. Mm-hmm. Well, imagine the amount of risk that was being carried by this practice if it already had 6 other independent contractors that were, probably misclassified.
Very good
should
chance.
Be employees.
Yeah.
For him, if he were to go through these steps and then buy into a practice that had all this exposure. And remember, he couldn't afford to make a mistake. And so this became a big issue on his plan A.
Yeah, totally understand. So, Michael, pretty crazy story. So let's go to commercial. And on the other side, let's talk more about the independent contractor from a legal perspective and what our audience needs to know when they hit the ding button when they see these types of agreements. But let's go to commercial.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season theme is red flags. And we mentioned in the first half of the show the IRS test for classification of independent contractor. And so let's talk a little bit more for our audience to really have a deeper dive of understanding. I mean, we red flagged it. It's obviously important. So let's talk about it.
And let me just add a little bit before I go into it. There's actually two levels of classification issues. So we always start with the IRS because that's kind of the front and center. But actually, each state
they do
has its own laws on employees versus independent contractors. So I'm sure you saw all the Uber litigation in California that has been going on over the last couple of years.
Yep.
And so it is a very real issue on a state level as well. So
totally agree.
From the IRS perspective, they used to use what was known as the 20-factor test to determine, is this person an employee or an independent contractor? And
can I ding the fact there was a 20-factor test?
Yes, and you can ding the word IRS too. Yes,
and ding.
Yes. So the and it gets down to the fact that the IRS really cares and wants to protect people, employees, from being put in a position where they're having to pay payroll taxes because the employers don't want to do it, and so they will crack down on this, and there's a lot of risk to the businesses. And so, in an effort to clarify and simplify the criteria,
ding,
yes, exactly, they streamlined and consolidated the 20 factors into 11 main tests.
Oh, better.
And organize them into kind of three main groups.
Okay.
The behavioral control group, the financial control, and the type of relationship of the parties. And so I figure we can at least on this episode talk at the three levels instead of going too deep and really putting our audience to sleep.
Sure. And I think, what I love is that you've broken up to this three. So let's start with behavioral control, which sounds like something that you would do as a parent, or maybe this is the adulting portion of the show still. But seriously, Michael, explain to our audience the behavioral control test.
So this part of it is all about trying to figure out, does the nature of the relationship make the business have some form of a right to direct and control how the worker does the task for which the worker's hired. Mm-hmm. And so they're really looking at this like, if you're an independent contractor and you come in, you know what you're doing and you do it. And if you're an employee, you're given you do A, B, and C in this way, and at a very high level. And so, some of the things they look at are the instructions given to the worker. Mm-hmm. And like I said, an employee is generally subject to instructions of when, where, and how they're supposed to work. Mm-hmm. And then, they may tell them what tools they have to bring to the work, or, what workers to hire or assist with the work. All of these elements of control kind of will weigh in on this behavioral control element for this, kind of three-part evaluation.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, behavior, same thing, is about control over that employee. And so again, just like we were talking about the parenting side, is how you're controlling the kids and how you're controlling the more authority you assert over it, the more control over their behavior. Okay, that makes sense. Let's go to that next test you mentioned, which was the financial control.
Well, this is all about looking at the degree to which the business has control over the business aspects of the worker's job. And so, things like the extent to which the worker has unreimbursed business expenses. Mm-hmm. So independent contractors are more likely to have unreimbursed expenses than an employee. And kind of an easy way to think about this is anytime you go hire an outside service, an outside business, and you're a business, you obviously know that that's an independent contractor relationship. In fact, they are paid on a 1099 basis, going back to how we talk about it. It just gets muddy when you're talking about an individual that you're trying to retain.
Sure.
They look at the extent of the worker's investment. So an employee usually has no investment in the work other than their own time.
Sure.
And so, all of these are just, I don't want to you can't get too hung up on any one of these things.
Sure.
Because just because you don't meet it doesn't mean that you still can't be an independent contractor.
Yeah.
And then, of course, a big one under this one is the extent to which the worker makes services available to the relevant marker. So independent contractors generally free to seek out business opportunities. And so what's funny is that you will oftentimes see, and especially in the professional world for healthcare, doctors and dentists, they'll say, here's an independent contractor agreement and your covenant not to compete.
Yeah.
Well, now you got like two risks. One, you have a covenant not to compete that may not be enforceable because they're going to be like, hey, this is an independent contractor relationship. How in the world can you make me have a non-compete? And then on the flip side, you have the potential misclassification because you are saying you're an independent contractor yet treating them like an employee. So it's a very tricky subject, but that's what what they're looking for there is, what level of freedom does that worker have to be going out and doing other things. And then they'll also look at like how the business pays the worker. Is it a regular wage amount, hourly, weekly, or other periods of time? The more systemized it is, the more it looks like an employee kind of paycheck type thing, the more that weighs against the employer for potential misclassification.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, the pattern you're starting to hopefully the audience is seeing is look at it from the IRS's perspective. If a business tries to hire someone, bring them on, and they give them all the roles so far that you've explained to us that makes them look like an employee, but they just hey, but we're calling it an independent contractor label, so therefore it's okay. And so that's, you can see how I've controlled the behavior. I'm now controlling basically how you're being paid and compensated and whether or not you're being reimbursed. So it's starting to, I think, hopefully the audience is seeing the light of all the different traps that are there or red flags. So, Michael, let's talk about the third test. I believe it says the type of relationship.
Yeah. So, the easiest one to kind of get your arms around it is what do you say the relationship is in your contract? And this is probably the least important criteria. We talk all the time about form and substance. I mean, you can't just say,
about to say that
you're an independent contractor.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that. But it is one element to the equation. So, yes, if you're actually going to treat them like an independent contractor, it's worth having an agreement and actually labeling them that way. It's form and substance, Brad.
Okay.
And, looking at things like benefits and all that, I mean, that defines the nature of relationship. I mean, the reality is if you're an independent contractor, they can't get benefits because they're not an employee. That's only reserved for employees. So, in the professional world with Dr. Green, he's going to have to buy his own malpractice insurance as an independent contractor. Yep. Again, another thing that weighs on everything in that equation. And then another aspect of the relationship is the permanency of the relationship. If you engage a worker, a company engages a worker kind of with an indefinite time period to it, that looks more like an employer-employee relationship than something that is more finite with a defined term. And so that's, again, you are looking holistically at the relationship, and they're also looking at, if you're a worker that's providing part of the core business of the business, that matters too. So a dental practice hiring a dentist as an independent contractor weighs against it, as opposed to a dental practice hiring an IT guy to come in and do a project.
Yep. Totally makes sense. And I believe I remember reading about this practical test that the IRS has too, that if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, that it's a duck.
That was probably what you learned when you were studying for the Louisiana bar. But it's true. I mean, you really can, if you just pause and look at, is this truly an independent contractor employee relationship? You can look at it. I mean, a contract that requires you to work 40 hours a week and go nowhere else is a classic employment relationship.
Yes.
By the way, that's what Dr. Green's contract said.
Oh, ding.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, sorry, I got caught in the moment.
Yeah.
I think the reason why, again, going back to if you have an independent contractor that is required to work 40 hours a week, that really does shift over as to how the IRS is going to view the entire relationship. And then you mentioned this earlier, is who's paying the payroll taxes, and the reason why that becomes an issue. And I think you said at the very beginning of the show is the IRS truly here is trying to ultimately to protect the employee from the cost that they would have to pay as an independent contractor, and basically making sure that the exposure, meaning that you mentioned benefits, all the benefits that a W-2 employee receives over a 1099. So let's pause all this IRS talk. I'm sure that the audience that's still awake, they want to know one thing. How did this turn out for Dr. Green?
Well, we tried to approach the practice to fix the model so that the risk would be mitigated in the future when he became an owner. The practice did not want to make a change. And as we said, Dr. Green did not have the flexibility to make a mistake on this, so he walked.
Yeah. So the practice employed the great strategy of the head in the sand.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Works like a charm, doesn't it? Well, until it doesn't. So what happened to Dr. Green? Everyone's going to know now.
Well, he moved to Dallas.
Good.
Invested in Dr. Nose's practice.
Ding,
and lost everything.
Ding. I'm hoping you're being very funny.
Yes. Yeah, I was trying to put a little flair into it because, you wanted a little more excitement to the story.
Okay.
He did really come and join a practice in Dallas.
Good.
And is now a partner and doing great.
That's awesome.
So, Brad, as we wrap up our first episode about red flags, independent contractors, what final thoughts do you have?
First off, you don't have to be a lawyer really to spot red flags, although it helps a little bit. Once you spot that red flag, though, you need to hit that pause button and make sure you have the right guidance to move forward. We said it already in the show, is that it's really important for the form and substance to match each other. And again, we've talked about this in other shows, because if the IRS is as best they can, they're trying to give us clear guidance as to what is substantial to them, as to a way in which they view the employer-employer relationship. You have to take it seriously. And just because your form says that it's not, does not make it so. So keep that in mind as you venture into the employment relationship and you start trying to bring on these employees. You want to minimize those exposures of misclassification. Michael, what are some of your final thoughts today?
I think in the real application of this, it starts to get blurry and kind of taking it back to the beginning of the show, not talking about my single days, it gets messy pretty quickly. And so a pro tip that we use when we're having a client that's an employer that's wanting to bring someone on, it probably looks like they're going to meet the independent contractor test, but there's some variables to it that we don't like, is we will have that individual form their own professional entity.
Yes.
And have the contract be between two professional entities instead of an individual and an entity. And the thought behind that, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the episode when I was talking about there's 4 different ways that money can be characterized, and really what it comes down is the two, a W-2 or a 1099. Well, a company or an entity by definition cannot be characterized as a W-2 employee.
Agree.
And so, we haven't seen the IRS or, for the most part, states kind of try to pierce through that setup and say, no, you're really, you formed this to just force this into an independent contractor, but you're not really that way. We want to use this strategy, but we want to use it for the purposes of shifting risk when it's kind of not clear about where it would fit on the test. I think that you do amplify your risk if you're clearly trying to be in an employment relationship and you just try to shoehorn it in through this kind of entity-to-entity strategy.
Totally agree. Great closing. Well, join us. Next Wednesday we'll continue with the theme of red flags. We'll be talking about phantom stock, and no, this is not a ghost story. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.